Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm doing this video partly because of the time of year that it is, because this is the weekend, at the very least, of Independence Day. And what I'm going to talk about is why we should be really thankful that we live in a time where these quote-unquote progressive people are simply taking off their masks and doing completely insane things, even if it is destroying some of the things that we love, because they're showing their real face at this point. And I want to talk about that partly because of something that happened in my life over the last week, and I just want to go over that and the depths of what these people will do or how they think and why and how we must be on guard for that, certainly if we wish to retain our freedoms. But before I begin, I should say, number one, this is going to be one of those videos where I seemingly talk about a whole lot of disconnected things, but I'm hopefully going to connect them all at the end. And number two, I'm probably going to tick off a lot of people with this video. Probably not everybody in the same place either. But I think that's okay. That's partly what I'm talking about, because being on this side of the fence, we're able to disagree with each other, sometimes vehemently disagree with each other, and still be able to listen to what the other person has to say. So what happened in the last week in my life that I want to discuss and use to bring out all of these things that I'm going to talk about? Well, I made a post, first on my YouTube channel, and then I always just stick it up on Twitter because I've already written the thing, I might as well just stick it up there. And I got some good discussion on the YouTube part of my post, but the Twitter part, that was very interesting. And I'll put that up in the background. And for those of you who don't watch the actual screen, I'll read it to you. It's only brief. It's a post from Marvel. It shows Destiny and Mystique from the X-Men stories. It says, their love reshaped the future of Marvel's mutants, and now they're reunited on Krakoa. Celebrate #Pride with Mystique and Destiny in these Marvel comics. And I screen captured that and said, is anyone else off-put by the fact that since Destiny's been rejuvenated, these two are now in a quote-unquote relationship, but back in the early 80s, when they first appeared, Destiny was Mystique's mother figure. Now, I'm going to get into my statement a little bit later in this video, but let's start at the very beginning. The very beginning being, why in the world would I use Twitter to begin with? And it's important to go over that for what I have to say later, because Twitter really is the toxic place. And it's toxic in a very specific way, because it's basically a societal shaming mechanism right now. And again, I'll get into that in a minute. But the reason why I use it is threefold. They are, number one, it's good for advertising. Number two, I can actually direct message some people that I want to connect with there, and that allows me more direct connection than email itself. And number three, because it allows me to see what the other side is saying. It allows me to see their reaction to some of the things that I have to say. And although a lot of what I would call offensive things show up in my Twitter feed, especially that's being promoted by Twitter itself, I do not block anyone. I allow them to say what they have to say because I want to see what they have to say. But for a moment, let's go back to that statement that I just made, that Twitter is a societal shaming mechanism. So I just want to say, Elon, buddy, if you're listening, that's what you have to stop this platform from being if you wish it to actually make money. But anyway, I've talked about this before, a difference between shame culture and guilt culture. And because I've talked about this before, I'm only going to go over it briefly here. And this idea, this scholarly idea, comes from classics scholars of ancient history and language and all that kind of stuff. And if I remember correctly, the most influential person of the classics professors that actually wrote about this would be F.M. Cornford, if you want to go back and look at some primary material. But the point is, they saw a significant difference between Christian culture and the ancient cultures that preceded it, in so much as the Christian culture was a guilt culture, and those other cultures in the classical period were shame cultures. And there's a very distinct difference between the two. And what you see these quote-unquote progressive people doing right now is they're trying to A, destroy Christianity, and B, create a neo-pagan shame culture. And Twitter is one of their very potent weapons to do this. Now, again, briefly, what's the difference between a shame culture and a guilt culture? Well, in a guilt culture, you learn and then internalize all of the ideas of what is right and wrong. Now, for a Christian, you would say they're already internalized by your very creation, the idea that the law of God is written on everybody's hearts. And of course, there is the idea of a conscience. Your conscience tells you right from wrong, and that is something that is ingrained within you. It's not something that is learned. And this is something which is very much a part of our legal system, a part of the idea of intent. And you can see this very clearly if you go back to something like the Nuremberg trials, where you had the defense saying, look, we were just following orders, so you can't blame us for just following orders. And the reason why they said they could blame them and they actually condemned them was because, no, you have a conscience. Your conscience can tell you what is right and wrong. You knew what was right and wrong, and you chose to do what was wrong. Therefore, your intent blossomed into action. Therefore, you're not getting off the hook by saying, it wasn't me, I was just following orders. But as I said, in a guilt culture, it's basically you internalize, whatever way you think that these internal mechanisms actually begin, you internalize the ideas of right and wrong. And so when you do something wrong, you point your finger at yourself through guilt and say, I did something wrong. I'm going to have to rectify that. But within a shame culture, there is no internal mechanism. The entire mechanism is external. And it's when you get caught doing something wrong that the people around you and the society around you will point their finger at you and say, you did something wrong. Rectify this situation. If you don't, you will no longer be allowed to be a part of A, the life of us individuals, or B, a part of larger society. And so the person, after getting caught, will have to amend their life if they wish to continue to act within that society. But here's the thing. Guilt culture is much more efficient than shame culture. Why? Because you always get caught. Because it's you pointing your finger at yourself. But within a shame culture, no. It's only when you get caught that you actually will try to make amends. And that mechanism for getting caught is much, much more lax because it's other people pointing the finger at you. They have to discover these things and then point the finger at you. So it's not very efficient, not compared to a guilt culture anyways. And it's also not very efficient because of the fact that, let's say, myself, RJ, I actually am part of a guilt culture. That is what I was brought up in. That's how I live my life. And I can understand, and to some degree, use the shame culture to my advantage. Whereas the opposite is not the case. You see, there is a part of shame within guilt cultures and a part of guilt within shame cultures, certainly. It's just what is the regular form of people amending their lives. But since I'm a part of guilt culture and it's internal, I can also explore the external from knowing the internal because I'm part of a guilt culture. But people who are part of a shame culture can't do that. They can't understand a guilt culture. Why? Because to them, all the rectification of actions is tied up within A, getting caught, and B, being shamed, which is all external, and they can't understand the internal. They don't have the mechanism to do that. And funny enough, it's actually baked right into Christianity that people trying to shame you, but you acting in accord with your conscience, that's actually a good thing. You actually should be happy when that happens to you because you're persecuted on behalf of doing what is right. And so you can use that to your advantage. You can say, yeah, I'm on the right path. And I know I'm on the right path because these people are trying to shame me. So when I made that post on Twitter, that's what happened. These people just came out of the woodwork. I got hundreds of responses, and they also told me that people on Reddit and also on Facebook were simply just making fun of me, trying to shame me into making some kind of repentance, or at the very least, never doing this again. And I found this fascinating. And the thing was that that's what they did. They tried to ridicule me. But the thing is, first of all, me being part of a guilt culture, I don't care. You can do that all you want. I simply don't care. But the other point that I want to bring up is that I found this actually useful in many ways. The first of all being I get to see what these people think, and that's partly what I'm doing this video on. But I have done this exact same thing before in my life, and I want to go over that just for a minute to show you how useful this can be, this shame culture when you come up against it. So the first business that I ever built was, in some respects, very close to the way that the comic industry works. It was made up of primarily freelance people. It was a very tight-knit, small community, group of workers doing very specific jobs. And on top of that, the majority of the people that worked in this sector were female. I would say probably 60 to 70% of the people were female. And the way that this industry worked was through social mechanisms. And I would say most probably because of the female aspect. So the way this little industry worked was based upon social rules. And I got in there and I looked at it and I said to myself, I'm here to work. I'm here to be businesslike. I'm not basing things on social rules. I'm going to do this in a business-like manner. And so I took those social rules and I ignored the ones that didn't matter, and I simply started to compete with other people instead of being social and building everything that way. And what happened after that? Well, a majority of the people in this industry went on a tirade for several years trying to ridicule me and drive me out of that industry. And part of that ridicule was the fact that I didn't do things the way everyone else did things, because I was looking at it and going, that's not very efficient. I can come up with a more efficient way to do things, and my clients seem to actually like it, therefore I'm going to do it that way. And when everybody else looked at what I was doing, they said, that's not the way you do things. You're an idiot. You can't understand the simple way that everybody does things, and things have been done this way forever. And at some point, their ridicule became real in their own minds, in thinking that I was simply a dullard and couldn't understand the way things worked. And I did nothing to correct that idea in their mind. Why? Because it was very, very useful to me. It was useful to me because I was doing things in a new way. I didn't want anybody copying my new way of doing things, and their ridicule of me, their thoughts that I was a moron and not being able to do anything correctly, kept these people far enough away from me so that they didn't stick their nose into my literal business. And then, after a handful of years, I started to take over the more lucrative parts of their businesses. And then, shortly after that, I just moved on and hired other people to do their jobs. So, 2 points I want to bring out of that. Number one being, yes, this ridicule aspect, when you are not actually part of this social ridicule, it's actually quite useful and something that you can use to your advantage. Number two being, and I've mentioned this before, I don't actually follow social rules. If those social rules are grounded in reality and in truth, sure, I'll follow them. But if I'm looking at a social rule, and I studied political theory, therefore I look deeply into social rules. That's part of what I have done for a long time. When I look at these social rules and find out they're not based on anything besides social rules, I say, to heck with that, I'm not doing that. There's no advantage to doing that at all. I'm going to follow the truth. I'm going to follow reality. I'm going to follow those things because they actually work. And quite honestly, in my life, I've had a number of people get very upset with me because I do this. Why? Because they say to me, you don't follow the rules. Why does everything work out for you? Literally, I've had people scream this at me. And the point being that, no, I don't follow your rules because they're not based on reality. I follow the rules of reality. I can parse the difference between the two, and I can follow what's real. And even if I try to explain that to them, it just makes them more and more upset. And very briefly, you see, that's exactly what I'm doing again right now when I'm building this business of writing and producing comics. I'm looking at Marvel and DC, and people keep telling me, why do you continue to do these videos and talk about Marvel and DC? They're dead properties. Just forget about them. I do this because I'm looking at the other side and saying, this is what doesn't work. Therefore, it's very useful for me to understand what does and what doesn't work. And at the same time, I can use ridicule of them, and it has some impact on them because they're part of a shame mechanism, and that's how they live, and that's how their company exists, and I'm actually making an impact against their company at the same time. But when they try to do the same thing to me, which they've been trying to do with Marvel and DC by shaming other people that create their own comics, it makes zero impact on me at all. Actually, it's to my advantage because they think I'm a dullard, because they think the rest of us who are making comics don't know what we're doing. We are just flies in the ointment, and we mean nothing. We can use that to our advantage. But let's move on to my statement itself that I put up on that post about a week ago and talk about that. And here's where I might offend a couple of people, but realize that when I make this statement, I'm definitely including myself in this. I think now I understand, after going through all of this over the last week, part of the reason why there is, to some extent, a substantial basis of people in the quote-unquote progressive category that read comics. Why? It's because their reading comprehension level is that of a grade 2-er. Well, between grade 2 and grade 4, that's the reading comprehension level, quite honestly. Why? because their ideological adherence and the ideology itself that they follow is not rational. Therefore, that ideology had to find a way to destroy reason, and one of their primary ways to do that was to destroy any real concept of language having a bedrock and having an understanding that is connected to reality. Therefore, these people cannot read words or speak words that they think are actually connected to reality. Therefore, they really can't understand plain English very well. Whereas I'm on the other side of the spectrum because I use language in a extremely rational, almost legalistic way. Partly because of my background within legal circles, but also partly because I'm using rationality and logic in a strict way, at the very least as best I can. And that boils language down almost to mathematical equations. And so, these people, in trying to ridicule me, the first thing that they did was to pull out a whole lot of panels from comics and say, look, these two characters are in a relationship in this panel. It's always been that way. You're a moron. But the thing being that when they showed me these panels, no one could show me a panel prior to 1989. And if you look at my post, it says early 80s. I specifically put in early 80s. I wrote the thing just putting in 80s, and then I said to myself, well, that's not the case. I need to put early before that. Again, being very legalistic every time I put something up, because I specifically meant early 80s. No one could show me anything from the early 80s, only from 1989 and forward. So my point still stands. After that, these people moved on to, well, it was the intent of Chris Claremont, the writer, to always portray them this way. But the thing being, number one, these people don't understand the fact that intent and action are two different things. Again, they don't understand the subtleties of language in any way. Just because he had that intent doesn't mean that's what it was back in the 80s. And I can attest to this myself as a writer and someone who has now written a comic and is writing several more comics right now. For my characters, their future and their past, and my intent for their future and their past changes literally with every panel that I write. So to say it was his intent is just to say he thought about it at one point while he was creating these characters. So I'm sorry, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that it blocks out all other intents. It doesn't mean that it blocks out all other interpretations until that intent became action, which again didn't happen until the late 80s. And I'm talking about the early 80s. And besides that fact, they keep on saying that it was his express intent and then showing me nothing from the man himself to say this, but just hearsay of other people from other interviews. And again, hearsay is not actual evidence. Now, I'm not saying that Chris Claremont never intended this. I'm not saying that he never made any kind of statement like this. He might have. I've looked for it. I can't find it. None of these people can find it. I wouldn't be surprised if he had, but no one can show me evidence that he did. Therefore, my point still stands. Plus, all of these people seem to ignore the very relevant fact that when he created these characters, if this was his intent, do you not realize that they were intended to be, both of them, villains? Literally, the first time both of them were introduced together, they had just changed the name of their team from the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Perhaps his intent was to show something on the villain side of the spectrum. But no, their thoughts will never go there. And finally, these people went on to try to ridicule my reading comprehension level. And I don't think I need to defend anything about that. I'm pretty sure most of my audience understands my reading comprehension level. But their point was that, yes, indeed, there was proof that he intended this and actually did this from the beginning, making these two characters in this sexual relationship from the very beginning of the early 1980s and possibly before, because there was subtext in there. They're saying, I can't see the subtext because I have a very low reading comprehension level and that it's right there. I just can't see it. Now, this is the point I want to concentrate on, because this is where the mask comes off for these quote-unquote progressive people. Because they're treating Chris Claremont, again, he might have intended this from the beginning. There might be proof that he intended this from the beginning. I have not been able to find that. If you want to point it out to me in the comments, you go right ahead. I will look into it. But the point is, they're treating this man as a hero for doing this. That is to say, putting in subtext into these early 80s and prior comics which expressed the fact that this relationship, this sexual relationship between these two women, existed in those early comics. And their claim is that he had to put it in there in a subtext because his editor at the time wouldn't have allowed it, the company, Marvel, wouldn't have allowed it, because the industry standard, which was the comic code, wouldn't have allowed it, and because society would not have allowed it. That's why he had to put it in there as subtext. And when they said that, and when they vehemently defended him as a hero for doing that, I said to myself, wait a second. What you're telling me is that you think this man a hero because as an employee, so he wasn't working as an independent at this time. He was quite specifically an employee. As an employee who was trusted with dealing with the property of his employer, which was these characters, in a medium which at the time was specifically for children, because the majority of people reading comics were children. I lived through the entire 80s. I remember the entire 80s. Yeah. Comics were for children. The majority of people, more than 50%, went out to children. They were directed towards children. That was their audience. So this man, as an employee, working with someone else's property, creating stories for children, put subtext, political and sexual subtext, into his comics, which would have been expressly quashed by his editor, which was Jim Shooter, if he knew about it, by the company, Marvel Comics, if they knew about it, by the comic code, which was the industry standard, if they knew about it, by society at large, if they knew about it. That's what you're saying? So in effect, you're saying that you see this man as a hero because he used a quadruple bluff of lies and deception in order to put political and sexual subtext into stories for children, all the while misusing the property of another. That's what you're saying. And their answer would be, yeah, that's why they think he's a hero. So you and I were looking out at the world today, and we're looking at these people who are trying to teach these things to children in public schools and whatnot, and trying to keep the public out so that they can do this. But really, they're doing it in a public setting. They're in a public school setting. It is a public setting. And these people are being condemned as groomers because that's what they are. But the point is that that's nothing. What these people on Twitter are telling me is that since the early 1980s and before, we've been doing it secretively in ways that necessitates multiple levels of lying to do the exact same thing. You see, this is the mask coming off. Now, very briefly, I just want to say some people will probably tell me, oh, you're just making things up now. No one would ever do this in the comic industry. Well, I'll point you to some of my older videos to prove this exact point. I'll go over them very briefly here, but link those two videos in the description if you want to go back and listen to the entire thing. I did a video about Kelly Sue DeConnick and her interview with the New York Times, and she said quite specifically that the entire reason why she got into writing to begin with was to change the world. How change the world? Well, she wanted to introduce her progressive, intersectional feminism into things. That's how she believed she was going to change the world. But she goes on to say that when Donald Trump became president, she had to shift gears and start to defend the people who were opposed to Donald Trump and start to create for them what she calls a bulwark, a safe place that they could retreat to in order to, again, in her words, gather together hope fuel and then go back out when the time is right and reclaim any territory that they had lost. And the point being that she's writing stories. Where do you think this bulwark is? This safe space, this place where these quote-unquote progressive politicians can go back for hope, is where? Well, it's primarily the minds of the readers. So yeah, quite specifically, she talks about inserting her political agenda into these stories in order to serve a greater agenda that really is just using the audience. I also covered another interview with another high-ranking editor at Marvel Comics, Bobbie Chase. She said when she got into Marvel, which I think was the late 80s, early 90s, when she started there, she was just looking for a job. And she was told when she got that job that she needed to take her politics and check them at the door, because the majority of people who read comics didn't agree with her northeastern progressive liberal way of thinking. And as she says in the interview, she basically nodded her head and then went about securing her position so that she could subvert things and actually bring all of that political agenda and baggage right in there, even though the people in charge would not have liked it. this is what she says specifically, and she does so because her parents did the exact same thing with politics. So again, if you want more description of that, I'll link those 2 videos in the description. And actually, there's a third one as well. I did one about a book con about 2 years ago. In this book con, Marvel Comics was desperately wanted to be a part of this book con. And in this book con, there was a specific panel that I covered about inserting progressive talking points into children's picture books. And they went to list about 25 progressive talking points that you should be inserting in there, and some of them definitely were of a sexual nature. And what they talked about, and they were quoting somebody, an older writer, so they weren't making this up themselves, but everybody agreed with this sentiment. They said, you need to do so by being so close to that little child that when that child is underneath their bedclothes with a flashlight reading your book, you have to be close enough to whisper in their ear through your story and teach them these progressive talking points. This is specifically what the panel was about. Again, I'll link that in the description if you don't believe me. So yeah, this has been going on for quite some time now, and I would not put it past Chris Claremont, even though I love his stories, I would not put it past him to actually say, yeah, that's exactly what I did. But here's my point. The point is that I don't actually follow terribly the actual lives of these people. I just follow what they put out. But Richard over at Comics Matter, he follows their lives in an almost intimate way. And he's been saying for the last about 6 months that these people are starting to, as he says, cloak themselves. He's using Star Trek terminology. They're starting to cloak themselves because they see hard times a-coming. And I think not just financial hard times, but also they see a shift in this culture, whereas they might begin to be shamed. Therefore, they're starting to hide themselves. Which is to say that for the last almost 8 to 10 years, they've done nothing but attack other people in this shame culture kind of way. But now they pretend themselves to be sort of 50s housewives. They talk about baking. They talk about cleaning. They talk sometimes about sports. That one I can attest to because every once in a while I go over and look at Willow Wilson's Twitter page because she's the creator of Miss Marvel, one of the creators. And suddenly, about 4 to 6 months ago, she started constantly talking about soccer like the thing was just invented. Anyway, Richard goes on to say that every once in a while they decloak just for a moment to attack somebody, and then they recloak, saying, oh no, I'm just a normal person. So this is what these people are starting to do right now. And I'm here to say that these people have not reformed, and these people will never reform. Do not be fooled by them, by their sudden silence, or even their going back to older ways of making comics and good storytellings. Never allow that to fool you. Now, a lot of people, even in my own life, when it comes to this point, they say to me, hey, you're a Christian. Doesn't it say in the Bible you're supposed to forgive and forget? And I look at them and I say, no, actually it doesn't. That is not a quote from the Bible. I do believe that's a quote from Shakespeare. That's not what I'm going to do. Actually, in my own tradition, which oddly enough is the same tradition as Richard, and Richard has used this exact same phrase that I used in my own life. No, in the tradition that I grew up in, it's forgive and remember. It's to say, sure, I forgive you, but I'm never actually going to trust you with this thing again, because I know I'm putting you in a position where there is a good probability that you're going to go back to the way that you did things. I'm not going to continue to blame you for what you've done, but I'm not going to give you a chance to do it again. And the reason why I say these people will never change is, of course, because they live in a shame culture, not a guilt culture. We're all looking at it and going, look, they've repented. They're actually doing things that show that they've turned themselves around. No, they haven't turned themselves around. Quite the opposite. They're faking turning themselves around because they don't want to be shamed. They're not turning themselves around because they don't have the internal mechanism, the system whereby they can recognize they actually did something wrong and then change their lives. No, they're just hiding. They're hiding because they don't want to be shamed. And as soon as they have the opportunity to actually shame others again and take control, they will do that exact thing. Again, because they don't have the mechanism to do anything else. And here's where I get to another point where people will probably not like what I have to say. All that you see around you today, this culture war and everything that has to do with it, it's all based upon the moral. It is all based upon a degradation of morals. You see, these people on the other side, these quote-unquote progressives, they wish to control everything through the political. But the thing is, what is the political? It's public morals. Philosophically, that's where it comes from. It's a part of moral philosophy. Politics is a part of moral philosophy. And here's the thing. If you're in a shame culture, well, it typically only works in one of two ways. Both of those ways which are connected, by the way. Number one being you either have to have a low information society, or if you have a high information society, you have to control all of the means of communication. And this is exactly what they're trying to do. And they're trying to do it because it's a shame culture, because they need to control people, because their morals are the only ones that can be in control. And so they need to control every last aspect of what you say, because indeed they want to control every last aspect of what you think. And if you don't believe that, again, just listen to these people on Twitter that I encountered who are saying, yeah, for the last 4 decades at least, we've been lying to you on multiple levels in order to get you to think that this was actually the case, but it wasn't. We were putting in our own political/sexual agenda in order to control what you think in order to get our way. And here's the point where I come into this and my entire channel, which is based around the idea of hero, and why I think we desperately need a rejuvenation of the heroic ideals right now. You see, moral philosophy is broken down into one of 3 sections. It's either the individual, which is just called ethics. Secondly, it would be economics, and people would say, what, economics? That doesn't make sense. Why? Because the old definition of economics was a well-run household. So it's actually talking about the family structure when it says economics. And thirdly, through the political. Those are all moral things. That's where morals come from. First, the individual. Second, the family. Third, the political. Well, at the very least, according to philosophical norms. And the point being that I go back to Aristotle all the time. Aristotle would say that if you have a piece of wood, a reed, let's say, and you need it to be straight, but it's bent, how do you get it to be straight? Well, you have to bend it back the other way in order for it to actually correct itself and then be straight. And that's what we're going to see in the near future. There is already started a backlash, and we're going to go in the exact opposite direction of these quote-unquote progressive people. But the point being that we're going to go over the mean position. We're going to go to an extreme in the other direction. But the question now becomes, what is that extreme going to look like? Because here's the thing. These quote-unquote progressive people, they've destroyed the individual morality by ridiculing everyone for the last 50 to 60 years who talk anything about religious morality or anything like that, personal morality. They've just been ridiculed out of the public square so that very few people are actually in the public square talking about that, talking about individual ethics and morals, because they've seen where it leads to. They've seen the shame that it leads to in this way. Secondly, they've sought deliberately to destroy the family unit. If you look at something like the Black Square movement, I'll put that in quotes, right on their website as one of their main points of what they were trying to do until they had to take it down was the destruction of the nuclear family. So they want to remove the individual, they want to remove the family unit, so there's only the political. That's all, and that's where the morals will come from, and they're in control of the political, therefore they tell you what's right and wrong. And the point being that many of us, whether we know it or not, we're ingrained in that kind of mindset. So when things start to switch back the other way, are we going to see a heavy-handed morality coming down from the political? And that's how we're going to readjust what has happened over the last 10 to 20 to 50 years? Well, we might. I don't think we should. But that depends on how people are going to react. Because, honestly, the Founding Fathers saw this coming. They based their ideas around a moral society. And where did they think those morals would come from? Well, they would come from, in their minds and in their documents, the family unit. But that family unit has been destroyed to a great degree. And so, we need to rebuild that family unit. We need to rebuild that place where that morality is going to come from, so we don't need a heavy-handed state morality to tell us what to do. And the thing is that it's in such a shambles right now, the only place that that's going to be rebuilt from is from moral individuals. Now you can take your morality, you can find it wherever you want. I'm going to leave you alone, unless of course you're drawing that from an unreal place. It needs to be based upon some kind of reality. I guess a better way to put that would be, if you wish to convince me that you're doing something moral, then you better be able to explain to me how your morals in themselves proceed from a rational principle. But the point being that for that morality of the individual to take any kind of root, right now, it needs to be a heroic effort to do so. It's going to take sacrifice, and it's going to take pain, and it's going to take all of those heroic ideals for you to live that kind of a life in order for you to be some kind of example to those around you and to society so that we can show others that no, even if we're going in the opposite direction, we don't need a heavy-handed moralization coming from above, coming from the political. And truly, that's the point of this entire video. You see, because as I said, these quote-unquote progressive people, in order to institute their neo-pagan shame culture, they need complete control over the means of communication and the political. We need to go in the opposite direction of that. And the opposite direction of that is the individual. And the individual needs to build himself up in a way, as Plato would say when he wrote his laws. After he talked about all of the laws necessary to govern the people's actions, he said, and then these people need to become noble unto themselves by making laws unto themselves. Because following this heroic ideal in our own lives is the only way that any of us will ever be able to follow the ideals set down by people like, say the Founding Fathers. And indeed, it's the only way that we, as individuals, as families, and as a society, will continue to be free. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.